But what I find when people start to move towards eating more plants, their taste buds actually do start to change. It was actually an A&E Reg who, was very much into stopping at, takeaway on the way home after a hard shift. And then over time, we started to add more plants into his diet. After one particularly hard shift, he went and got a Big Mac, and he saw me in clinic about 2 weeks later, and the look on his face as he described how disappointed he was that he just didn't get that buzz like he used to, was kind of like magic in a way, that it just after the 5 to 6 weeks, my taste buds just changed. And I'm like, you know what? It's not magic. It's based on science. We know that our microbes in our mouth, as well as our taste buds, really do change according to what we feed them.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle. Megan, thank you so much for coming back on the pod. So much has happened over the last couple of years since the last time you were here. Fill us in. What has been going on in your world?
Gosh, what has it been, about 2 years or so? I mean, can we talk about that virus?
Yeah.
That in terms of, I guess, my research world, COVID-19 has had such a huge impact on our ability to recruit to studies. So a lot of our research studies looking at different things like food additives and inflammatory bowel disease, and looking at different fibres and IBS have actually had to be put on hold because we couldn't get the participants to come in. So thankfully things are starting to open back up. Outside of that, I mean, the gut health clinic has been a really exciting area that I've developed further. So we've got a team of now 9 gut specialist dietitians.
Wow.
Where, it's just this huge demand for people to get, quality support for gut issues. And we know that, 20% of people suffer with some sort of gut issue. So for me, it was really important, I guess, to create, a team of people who actually know what they're talking about and very much evidence-based and can help people. What else has happened? Personal life. I've had a baby.
Yeah, just that small addition. Yeah.
Which has probably been the biggest roller coaster of my life. Absolutely. Little Archie, he's now 10 months old. Time flies, as everyone always says. I'm going to be completely honest and say that it was incredibly harder than what I thought, to kind of juggle, the work side of things. But then also, trying to be a really dedicated mum. I think 4 weeks after he was born, I had to, do some media work for BioMe, which is my food company as well, that got launched. So yeah, it was a lot to deal with, but I mean, there's nothing more special than when he looks up at you and you're just like having a really crappy day and you're like, okay, that's fine. I can handle having a crappy work day when I've got you to kind of play with at the end of the day.
Megan, you're such an inspiration, honestly. If people only knew like the behind the scenes, that just the front of everything, just the facade of everything that you're doing with your gut clinic and your products and your books and everything, but the behind the scenes is even busier, and that's like, it's just so amazing to see you juggle everything. I mean, I know it's a struggle, but still.
Rupi, I mean, the same with you. We were just, talking offline. There is just so much that goes on the back end, where, the hours that you have to put in to kind of, I guess, do your job justice. And, we both have the same message of trying to really help people live their, healthier, happier self.
Yeah.
And to do that, there's a lot of work behind the scenes, but it's all worth it, isn't it? At the end of the day.
Totally, yeah. And I'm glad, I do want to say here, I did predict, I think I might have even said it on the podcast, actually, the last time we were on, I did predict that you're going to have a food brand. And I'm glad I planted that seed subconsciously and it's grown.
I reckon that was probably you, because like I said, I didn't really have any, conscious ambitions of doing that. It just, opportunities came up and I'm like, there's clearly a gap in the market. So, yeah, maybe you should get some shares in the company then.
Yeah, maybe. Well, if you do put any out for crowdfunding, then I'll definitely be the first one in the line. And Rochelle actually did remind me to say that she absolutely loves the granola. We've got some in our kitchen. We always have it stocked, so it's amazing.
And you got engaged.
Yeah, I got engaged.
And nutmeg. I mean,
and nutmeg.
A lot's happened in your world.
Totally. Nutmeg and pistachio still need to meet. It's a very good combination, that. Nutmeg
it is, a flavour.
Yeah. Very Italian. Look, you got this new book, Eat More, Live Well. I absolutely love it. I've got a copy here. I've read the whole thing. You've got 80 new recipes in it. They all look amazing. We're going to talk a bit about the front part of the book, which is where you've done a deep dive into something that you describe as the diversity diet that I want to ask you about. Why don't we start there, actually? What do you mean by the diversity diet, and what has this been based on in terms of what the latest evidence is in the gut microbiota?
Yeah, so essentially it's a way of eating. So it's not like, those restrictive diets. It's a principle backed by 5 key principles that essentially, I guess, taps into the latest scientific evidence about not only how our body works best, but our gut microbes work best. And I think that's, been a really big missing part in how we understand food and nutrition impacts our overall health in terms of chronic diseases, but also longevity. And it's been the discovery of our gut microbiome, those trillions of microbes, and how food impacts them is kind of like that missing kind of key in our understanding. And essentially it's that made me write the new book, in terms of trying to bring together, that latest scientific evidence about what are the key principles, what things should we be thinking about in terms of not only nourishing our body, but also our gut microbes. And like I said, it's those 5 key principles. Things like eating mostly plants doesn't necessarily mean only plants, focusing on inclusion, not necessarily exclusion, going for whole, not refined, thinking about enjoying your food. So cultivating kind of that community around our nutrition, because we know that actually that can have a really big impact on our digestion and also our relationship with food, which I think shouldn't be overlooked. Certainly, as a clinician, I've seen for the past decade, people's relationship with food really is an important thing to tackle for long-term overall health.
Yeah, I'm really glad, and it's really refreshing to see that community element come into some of those principles, because I think certainly as clinicians, we have a tendency to stick to what we believe is going to be a harder evidence, i.e. the calories or the amount of fiber down to the gram and stuff. But the communal aspect of eating and the method of eating and even your beliefs about what you're eating can certainly have a demonstrable impact on our physiology.
Absolutely. I mean, very well about this nocebo effect. So the opposite of placebo. Placebo, if you, take a supplement or eat a food and you think it's going to do you good, then, about 30% of people do feel better. The nocebo effect essentially is the opposite of that, where if you're ingesting something which you think is bad for you, then you can physically manifest symptoms. And we see it all the time in our clinical trials at King's, where we do blinded trials, specifically in people with irritable bowel syndrome. If they have a belief that gluten is bad for them, even if we give them a non-gluten food, but they believe that has gluten in it, they can actually physically manifest symptoms.
Wow.
And it's not like, people being crazy and it's all in their head. It's our body's natural protection. If we get food poisoning because, we have some off chicken, a lot of people can't ever eat chicken again, even if it's, not off, because they've got this association with that food. So the nocebo effect is such a huge one that I think we need to discuss more about with all of these media headlines, saying that these foods are really evil or they're really bad for you. Because we know it plays out in physiology, like you said.
Yeah. And I think you're right. The vernacular that we use, particularly in the media, can certainly have an impact as well. So we have to be cautious about how we describe foods, and I think that's what you've done really excellently with your dismissal of things like superfoods, because there's a beautiful image. One of my favorite pages in the front end of the apple sliced in half and looking at all these different attributes, the micronutrients, the phytochemicals, the fiber, and all that kind of stuff. And it makes you really appreciate these like humble hero foods that we kind of disregard as like average or regular. Whereas when you dive a little bit deeper, look under a microscope, and you see just how amazing these foods can be. And that's, I guess, the sort of foundation of what the diversity principles are in terms of the diet.
Absolutely. So each different type of, plant food. And when we say plants, a lot of people think, it's just, your fruit and your veg. But I talk about these super six. So you got your whole grains, your nuts and seeds, your fruit, your veg, your legumes, your beans and your pulses, and your herbs and your spices. And each different category provides your body with an array of different plant chemicals. Like you said, that humble apple contains over 300 plant chemicals. 100 million bacteria in each and every apple. And there's just so many facets. And that's, just an apple. If you extrapolate that out to all the other foods available, you start to appreciate how, amazing, Mother Nature is. And therefore, to really maximize the nutrition you can give not only your body, but the gut bacteria, you need to think about not just having apples every day, mixing out with things like buckwheat, quinoa, bananas, peaches, all of that sort of stuff. So I do recommend on the diversity diet for people to aim for at least 30 different types of plants per week, which, for some people might be like, oh my God, that sounds horrendous. I could, I'm not going to do all that shopping. It's going to cost more, but that's honestly not the case. So many, simple hacks. Instead of just getting things like your canned chickpeas, get your canned 3-bean mix. Instead of just getting your pumpkin seeds, get your, 4-seed mix. It's just wherever you can, think diversity, because each different type of plant will give your body different nutrients.
That's a really good point, actually. So I'm going to opt for garam masala rather than just standard cumin next time.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of what the science is highlighting. And, it's not just, I guess, these different individual chemicals, but also there's this amazing synergistic effect of combining different foods. So we know that things like good sources of magnesium and good sources of prebiotics, if you combine them together, actually the prebiotic, which is specific types of typically fibres that feed the good bacteria, actually help your body absorb magnesium more efficiently. So that's why if you get the dates that contains the prebiotics and add some nut butter that contains the magnesium, that's like a winning combination. So this synergistic effect of food as well is, another reason why we should start to think diversity wherever we can.
Yeah, definitely. And so you mentioned these 30 plants a week, and you've got plant points for every recipe that I think is a really nice sort of trigger for people to think about, okay, how am I getting diversity in this recipe? Where did the research come from looking at these plant points? I know we've heard a lot from different people in the gut sphere in both America and over here as well in Kings. Where was the sort of foundation for that, and how did we see, and what sort of associations did we see with that?
Yeah, so the key research came from Rob Knight's group in the US, and they brought together, they collect a lot of microbiome data. So they have all of these volunteers sharing their stool samples and also their dietary intake. And what they found is that people who ate at least 30 different types of food per week had better gut health, so more diverse range of microbiome, which is a bit of a marker for gut health, compared to those who ate the same 10 on repeat. Now, I think they did a really great job, because what they did is looked a little bit deeper and compared people who were vegan, so 100% plant-based, versus those who are omnivores, so still ate plenty of plants, but also ate animal products. And actually what they found is that despite all the myths, all the rumors out there, being vegan didn't mean that people had better gut health. The key predictor was that diversity. And again, that's why, when I'm talking about the diversity diet, the concept is mostly plants, but it doesn't necessarily have to be only plants. I completely understand for, cultural, environmental, religious, animal cruelty reasons, etc., why someone might want to go plants only. But actually, in terms of, human health, the science doesn't necessarily say it's any healthier. In fact, as you are very aware, Rupi, if you are going 100% plant-based, you do need to be careful of some key nutrients, like things like choline, long-chain omega-3s, selenium, iron, all of those sorts of things. So you can get, not all of them, but most of them from plants, but you have to be, quite savvy with your nutrition.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that perspective, actually, because even though I'm largely plant-based as well, let's say largely 100% whole food plant-based, I do still believe that for an optimal human diet, it does require different animal products, and there's evidence to show that. Whereas when we deal with diet, we're not just dealing with the food that we put on our plates, like you eloquently said. It's about the environment, your religious and cultural beliefs, your understanding of how food impacts sustainability and all these other elements. So unfortunately, that can almost cloud the findings or the interpretation of findings that you'll find on social media. And it's a difficult one to navigate. I mean, what's your experience been like that regard, especially as a lot of people might have jumped onto the term plant-based to mean 100% whole food plant-based, i.e. vegan?
Yeah, so there is a bit of a conversation to have. And again, that's, something I I talk about in the book that the plant-based is very much a spectrum, and the kind of the clue is in the name. So it's plant-based. So the base of your diet is plants, and whatever you choose to add on top of that is up to you. It's not necessarily plants only. And I think, you know, with social media, we have tended to kind of really latch on to, you know, a title of how we eat. So, you know, there are a lot of people who follow a vegan diet very strictly. And for someone like me who, you know, talks about the evidence behind gut health, to say that actually some animal products, things like oily fish and fermented dairy, are beneficial for our health, they can get a little bit aggressive and upset that that's not in line with, I guess, their beliefs and maybe what they've read from Dr. Google. So there is kind of a fine line about, again, sharing that evidence-based information, but being cautious of other people's beliefs. And I guess that fine line between beliefs versus the evidence, which is something that hopefully we can use social media to kind of politely share in an evidence-based way.
It's a tricky environment to work in. I mean, you've been in this environment now for years, as have I. So I think we're sort of developing thicker skins when it comes to conversation. I mean, I was just saying offline, like I am actually looking forward to the day where I don't need to utilize social media as much as I have to at the moment, because you know, most of our environment is now moving digital. Like, we're already sort of living in the metaverse, for want of a better word. So yeah, I just think curating that is something that I think will give me personally a lot of headspace. That will probably help my microbiota as well.
Yeah, we absolutely know the stress of social media can have a negative impact on our gut microbes. And I mean, it's catch-22. We know that social media can be a really powerful platform for us to get our messages out there and reach people that perhaps we wouldn't have historically. But also, it can be a hungry beast, and it can be a bit frustrating when people can spread myths like wildfire, and we're, you know, working so hard to get some of the evidence out there that doesn't quite, I guess, land as well as these myths.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned the plant-based index in the intro as well. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the plant-based index. There's so many indices out there. Like, there's the dietary inflammatory index. There's a healthy eating index. Well, I don't think I've actually come across the plant-based index before. Yeah,
so this was developed by some researchers, I guess, to prove the point, or to investigate the point of whether, you know, eating plants necessarily means you're any healthier. And what they did is, I guess, categorize the different types of plants out there. And essentially it was whole plants. So things like, you know, whole grains, whole fruit versus refined plants. So things like, you know, sucrose or added table sugar, fruit juices, you know, pastries and those sorts of things. And so they categorize the different types of plants. So the healthy plant food index versus the unhealthy plant food index. And they have a massive cohort of participants, so thousands of patients. And they looked at where their diet kind of indexed on these two different types, the healthy index versus the unhealthy index. And with the healthy index, they showed that the top tier of people, you know, following quite a high healthy plant-based index, i.e. whole plant foods, like I talk about in the diversity diet, had a 25% lower risk of heart disease. Just because you are vegan, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that you're healthy. It's about looking at the types of plant food you're having. Now, that's not to say that, hey, you can't have some added sugar. Absolutely can. And I think that's one of the key principles on the diversity diet. It's not, you know, thinking about cutting out foods. It's just about basing your diet on these whole plants. And hey, if you want to add some treat foods in there, absolutely. But what I find when people start to move towards eating more plants, their taste buds actually do start to change. And, you know, I talk about the case study in the book where it was actually an A&E Reg who, you know, was very much into stopping at, you know, takeaway on the way home after a hard shift. And maybe you can relate to that, Ruby, yourself. I know my husband
I totally relate to that. Totally relate to that.
Yeah. And then over time, we started to add more plants into his diet, and he was, you know, less inclined to get fast food. After one particularly hard shift, he went and got a Big Mac, and he saw me in clinic about 2 weeks later, and the look on his face as he described how disappointed he was that he just didn't get that buzz like he used to. It was like, I'd taken something away from him. But then, you know, when we talked it through, he was like, obviously I see the benefit. It's like, it was kind of like magic in a way, that it just, after the, you know, the 5 to 6 weeks, my taste buds just changed. And I'm like, you know what? It's not magic. It's based on science.
Yeah.
We know that our microbes in our mouth, as well as our taste buds, really do change according to what we feed them.
Yeah, this is a really good point, I think, from the behavior change aspect in clinic, because I mean, I try and encourage people every time to, you know, try and include diversity in their diet and mix it up with all those preventative health properties. And I was quite surprised to hear about the regeneration of our taste buds and how that can change so rapidly. And that explains of what I see anecdotally during my clinical practice. So I wonder if we could talk a bit about how your taste buds regenerate in relationship to the habitual diet that you have, and why that's related to repeated exposure. And I guess it's pretty intuitive for people to think about when we think about how we've evolved from childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, and our taste buds have changed to appreciate different things.
Yeah, I mean, remember your first drink of wine or coffee?
Yeah.
It was like,
Exactly.
oh, or dark chocolate even. I was like, get that away from me. But absolutely, you know, that kind of exposure, that ongoing exposure, your taste buds really do kind of get used to it and even start to crave it. So we know that our taste buds regenerate every 10 or so days. And there is, you know, amazing
10 or so days. That's like,
yeah,
that's so
I know.
quick.
It's the turnover. And I mean, you know, if you burn your tongue, actually your tongue does heal quite fast.
Yes, it does.
In fact, I actually, you know, back in the day, I had my tongue pierced. And
Oh,
I
did you?
remember, yeah, I mean,
Back
in
in the
Australia, I think Australians, it was like a cool thing to do in my teens. Anyway, my mom was horrified. But actually, I noticed that when I would take it out, after like 1 or 2 days, it would start to close up. Whereas like every other piercing, like your ears pierced, your belly button pierced, wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So my tongue is, you know, it does turn over quite rapidly.
Actually, that's a really good point, because in A&E, whenever we have buccal injuries, it can look pretty gnarly, for want of a better term. You know, as long as it's not completely through or completely through the tongue or anything like that, it does heal very quickly. And you have to remind them that, you know, it's going to be stingy for a little while. You might need to use a bit of local anesthetic, but it does heal. And on the subject of piercings, and a lot of people don't realize this, during med school, I actually had an eyebrow piercing. Can you imagine?
No way!
Yeah, I had an eyebrow piercing, but my it only lasted like 6 months. My body just would not keep it. It was like over here. I've still got a tiny scar there. People think sometimes that I like shave my eyebrow. I do not.
That
shave
looks
my
like
eyebrow.
it does. It looks like that's your kind of your mark, your trademark. I love
my trademark. Yeah. Trying to be a pop star in a former life. No, but yeah, you know, just a little anecdote about the mouth. It does turn over really quickly, and so I guess that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, if we look at, you know, food industry, there was a big move around reducing salt, and actually took out about 40% of the salt in cereals. So it was like, I think it was like 240 tons of salt over several years. And most consumers, I know back in the day, that was my kind of breakfast as a kid growing up. None of us really noticed that change, because it was just a slow, gradual change.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, one of the key mechanisms. But I guess more recently, with our understanding of our microbiome, so we not only have the gut microbiome, we have our oral microbiome, so the billions of bacteria that live in our mouth, is that actually the research is showing that they also are thought to have a role in our taste perception. And we know that when we change our diet, our microbes in our mouth also start to change. In fact, you know, I'm sure you're aware of this, that, you know, the important roles of nitrates for blood pressure regulation, so things like beetroot, actually our oral microbiome are the ones that kind of transform that nitrate into nitrite, so then our body can absorb it and have that benefit. And that comes down to our microbes. So, you know, there's so much coming out highlighting how important these microorganisms throughout our entire body are. And that's just, one example around taste perception. But for those who, you know, I gave that anecdote about, you know, the client, and you've seen in clinic as well, there is actually hard research showing that adding more plants into your diet after just 2 weeks, people became more sweet sensitive, more salt sensitive. So these ultra processed foods kind of didn't sit as well. And they also started to have a more kind of higher craving rates for plant-based foods. So for the people who say to me, oh, I could never, eat more plants, like my husband at the start, I'm like, you'll see.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, I think you gotta have some good tasting plant-based food to appreciate that. And the second thing is you can certainly appreciate the complexity, the bitter notes, the natural sweetness in whole foods a lot more. I mean, people always laugh because I crave greens on the side of my meal now. I crave like having something seasonal and fresh with whatever I'm eating. And you will start to appreciate that as you move to a more habitual way of eating that has naturally a lot more plants in your diet. So it is really interesting to see that there is research to suggest that your taste buds will change. That's mediated by the gut microbiota and the microbiota in different areas. And it is possible to appreciate tender stem broccoli or whatever greens you like.
Yeah. And, that is coming from also my husband's experience. So Rupi, you're a health guru. I mean, everyone probably expects that you'd crave greens. My husband, massive meat eater, would eat out every night. But, even last night he was making a bolognese and I noticed without me saying anything, he added in 4 plant points. So he had just a tin of mixed beans. And then also added in some peas and mushrooms all on his own. And he would never, ever have done that before. And didn't know that I was watching him either. So it is possible, guys. It really is.
Yeah, the gut health police. That's brilliant. We've mentioned the words, the gut microbiota, the microbiome. You've got a really nice section where you define exactly what all these different terms are. I wonder if you could just sort of take us through exactly what happens when you consume fiber and the steps of digestion, how that interacts with all those different names of areas that we've been talking about, just to give the listener a bit of an anchor of what we're talking about, and then we can go into what actually a healthy gut might look like.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great one, because thanks to the public guidelines out there, I think we all know that we need to eat more dietary fiber. In fact, in the UK, we have less than 20 grams of fiber. The government says we need to have at least 30 grams of fiber. The clinical trials showing this really important brain boosting and mental health boosting effect of dietary fiber had 50 grams of fiber in that diet per day. So, fiber is a bit of a buzzword, but I think people don't necessarily understand why it's beneficial for them. And having that understanding, I think, really can help people increase, their motivation and their focus on it. So dietary fiber, which is like the backbone of all those plant foods. So as I mentioned, those super six, they're all a great source of dietary fiber if you eat the whole form of them. And when we think about our digestive tract, it's this 9-meter long tube that delivers the food from entry all the way to exit. And dietary fiber actually travels through most of that digestive tract undigested. So things like most carbs, proteins, and fats get digested higher up that digestive tract by human enzymes. We break that down, get it into small little particles that then gets from our gut to our blood, and that then filters throughout, feeds our heart, liver, muscles, etc. Now, the thing about fiber is that human cells don't have the enzymes to break down and digest that fiber. So like I said, it travels through most of our 9-meter digestive tract undigested until it makes its way to the last 1.5 meters, and that's called the large intestine. Now, historically, no one wanted to talk about the large intestine because that's where poop is made. But now we appreciate that actually that last 1.5 meters is where most of our gut microbes live. So most of the bacteria live there. And the amazing thing about them is they have those specific enzymes to break down fiber. So without these bacteria, we wouldn't be able to get the benefits from dietary fiber. So the bacteria ferment the dietary fiber and release a range of different chemicals, including these things called short chain fatty acids. And these are like magic kind of chemicals. They help strengthen our gut lining. They help strengthen our immune system. They are thought to be important in regulating things like our appetite hormones, glucose release, our brain axis, all of those sorts of things is thought to be in part due to these chemicals.
Yeah. One of my favorite lines in your book, do you want to know what it is?
Tell me.
Your microbes are foodies by nature. I love that line. It's so, you know what, I've got this image of like a microbe version of Jay Rayner or like Grace Slater in your gut, just like, you know, looking through it. Oh no, I'm not going to have that. Oh yes, I'll have this. Yeah. So that's like a really nice way of describing it. And I've heard you say in previous talks and stuff that, you know, instead of thinking about what you and your body and your muscles need for energy and a recreation and all the rest of it for their function, think about it from the lens of what your microbes require for them to do their job, such that they can look after you and your body. That's a really nice way of sort of giving people the perspective into how we should really be thinking about food on top of everything else as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not about forgoing your favorite foods. Like you've said, it's just about thinking, okay, what am I feeding my taste buds? But what am I also going to feed my gut bacteria? So every meal, every snack, that's literally, as a nerd, what I think in my head. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to have some, you know, some chocolate here, but hey, why don't I add some mixed nuts or mixed seeds in it, those plant foods, to then feed the gut bacteria at the same time, because they are working incredibly hard for our body. And, you know, the research is highlighting that you want a really good, solid working team of gut bacteria in you if you want to be your optimal, you know, performance, even athletic performance, but things like your mental health and longevity as well.
Yeah. At different points in the book, you know, you're talking about how your microbes can boost your energy, improve your mood, regulate digestion, even involved in weight control. And I guess you can break it down into these different axes and how they interact with each other. You talked about a whole bunch of them, so we're just going to like look at a couple that I think perhaps we haven't given as much attention on the show. So why don't we talk about the gut skin axis, or more accurately maybe the microbiota gut skin axis, as is being referred to now in the literature.
Yeah, so I mean, this area really excites me in terms of the science, which highlights we literally have like the second skin of the billions of microbes on our skin, i.e. our skin microbiome. And it's this microbiome that's thought to be actually really important for things like inflammatory states of the skin, so things like psoriasis and eczema. And, you know, things like acne, you know, as a medic, that, you know, the first line therapy for acne is antibiotics, both topical and oral. And that's because we know that this dysbiosis of the types of skin microbiome can, you know, create the active, you know, components of acne. Of course, there's a genetic element, which then changes the hormones on your skin, which then changes your skin microbiome. But I guess how we see the gut microbes and the skin connecting is, you know, this really, I guess, new and fascinating area. And I think probably anyone who's listening to this can relate that if they go one too many days without many plant-based foods, you know, it plays out on their skin. And there's some really great research highlighting that those plant chemicals, so specific polyphenols and things like dark chocolate, some, you know, really robust clinical trials shows that in having them in high doses actually had measurable impacts on skin elasticity, as well as, you know, the appearance of wrinkles in a, you know, blinded clinical trial. So, you know, I joke in the book about, hey, should I get more Botox or just eat more plants? But, you know, there is good evidence to highlight how we nourish our gut bacteria can really impact our skin health as well. And the microbes on our skin, you know, they have been used as a better predictor of our age compared to things like our gut microbiome, highlighting that, you know, I think the future of, you know, maximizing our youthful appearance, obviously internally through diet, but externally through really nourishing our skin microbiome. Although, you know, just be cautious. There's a lot of companies out there now that's jumped onto this pre-probiotic kind of skin regime without any clinical trials. So just being cautious that if you are going to invest money in, you know, skin products, you say, has there been a clinical, a human trial showing that this product is going to really help my skin microbiome? So just being savvy there, I think, until we have that really hard evidence.
Yeah, no, for sure. Without naming company names, are there any particular ingredients that you're excited about, have a future, or perhaps are even things that we could do right now in terms of nourishing the skin from the outside, obviously taking into account the fact that we're obviously going to be doing it inside as well.
Yeah. So I think inside is definitely where we've got the most evidence, but there has been a company who I've started to work with behind the scenes, who are actually undertaking clinical trials, looking at these topical prebiotics, so specific types of inulin, which can help, I guess, nourish those topical topical bacteria on the face, and then also postbiotics. So they're not the live bacteria. So this is another P word people might start to hear, is the word postbiotic. So it's the chemicals the bacteria have actually produced, because we obviously know that probiotics are live microbes. That's a definition. They have to be alive to be called a probiotic. That's quite hard to keep, for a skin product, unless you're going to keep it in the fridge and all that sort of stuff, or you choose the strains that are heat stable. So they're just taking the chemicals the bacteria are producing and putting them into products. There is some really exciting research being done at the moment to look at that sort of thing. In fact, there's other research looking for people who suffer with things like eczema. Because actually, I don't want to get too much down a rabbit hole, but I think, so many people are affected by eczema, and there's really good scientific evidence that if you have a family history of eczema, and you are looking to conceive, to take a specific type of probiotic throughout your pregnancy and for 6 months after, reduces your baby's risk of getting eczema by 50%.
Wow.
So it's really, really strong evidence. And I talk more about, I guess, that probiotic prescription in the first book, Eat Yourself Healthy. But we can just put it in the show notes after I talk about the, what dose, what type of bacteria, duration, all that sort of stuff. But a lot of people say, well, hey, I've got eczema. Can I take a probiotic? And actually the evidence is saying that probably not helpful as a treatment so far in the probiotics being tested. We know different probiotics do different things, but as a treatment, there has been a small clinical trial looking at a skin microbiome transplant, where they take those microbes from someone without eczema, and then they put them onto someone with eczema. And that treatment actually had a really significant clinical importance in reducing their eczema as a flare-up. So I think this whole area of targeting the skin microbiome is going to be huge in the next couple of years for treating skin conditions.
Do you reckon you're going to get loads of people with eczema just trying to hug people?
If I suffered with eczema, I'd be very tempted to every day to my partner, just rub and rub. Obviously for a skin transplant, you need to go through specific protocols. So it's not a case of just rubbing on them. They need to reduce down what you've got and then label on top, kind of like a fecal transplant, right?
Yes.
Totally, I want people, I guess, to be excited about the potential of this area, but then also I think be savvy about where they're investing their money, because this is still very much in the research stages, and this stuff can take a couple of years to translate. So be careful about where you're investing your money.
Yeah, totally. I certainly see this, particularly in the wellness industry, where you see buzzwords being used to advertise the product, or maybe they've got something in there that resembles a probiotic, even though it's unlikely to be live. And then just, it flying off the shelves because of a N of 15 study or something like that, where they've obviously, not done it rigorously enough. And I wonder, so you've got prebiotics, and that's sort of understandable in terms of feeding that microbiome that lives on your skin. And the metabolites of healthy microbes, are there certain metabolites that spring to mind, or things that you think we should be looking out for specifically in terms of their chemical names? Or is that still...
So a lot, like I mentioned before, those short chain fatty acids seem to be one of the key metabolites that we're looking at and investigating. So the butyrate, the propionate, and things like that. However, so you might even start to see companies advertising these postbiotics in oral form. So, hey, why don't we bypass the need for prebiotics to feed the bacteria and bypass the bacteria themselves and just have those postbiotics? But actually, for those postbiotics to actually get to the right spot, that large intestine, to really work their magic, they have to pass through, obviously, the acidic gut, go through a lot of enzymatic change, which actually is thought to denature them. So I do think, with enteric coated capsules, this will be an area again in the next few years we may have more targeted response to, but at the moment, not so much.
Yeah. fascinating. Definitely an area to watch, and I think there's certainly a lot of things that we can do right now, but certainly a lot of things to look forward to in that space as well. And that's really exciting that you're working with a company that's actually doing rigorous trials. I can't wait for that to go public.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure you're the same whenever you're looking at working with companies. Yeah, there's so many on the market. Literally every day, I'm sure you get the same companies saying, hey, endorse this and do that.
Yeah.
So when I heard about this company actually doing clinical trials, I was like, I need to work with you. This is hugely exciting. So yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, let's talk about that virus. Everyone is looking to bolster their defenses, and there's a lot of talk about the microbiota being particularly important when it comes to reducing the severity or even reducing the chances of contracting lots of different viruses that are just within the communities, but specifically with regard to COVID-19 and the negative effects of that. Are there any things beyond diet that could potentially help with lowering the risk of upper respiratory tract infections and COVID-19 in particular?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, diet, if we talk about probiotics, there's actually really good scientific evidence for taking specific types of probiotics for reducing the risk of the common cold, i.e. the upper respiratory tract infection. In fact, that's where the hypothesis about, hey, could the gut microbiome have a role in COVID came from, because there's such robust Cochrane reviews showing that the bacteria Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG and BB12, those two combined together have been shown to reduce people's duration of the common cold by 2 days compared to placebo, as well as reducing the overall risk of getting the common cold. So there actually is really good evidence for that type of virus, so the common cold type of virus. In terms of COVID-19, there was a pilot study highlighting what they did is they gave people who had contracted COVID-19 in the hospital settings, they're quite unwell. And so one group got the specific probiotic alongside standard medical therapy, and the other one just got standard medical therapy, and found that those who had the probiotic in combination actually had it was a massively reduced risk of needing respiratory support. Wow. So that study's now being extrapolated out. And there's about 12 other studies currently underway looking at different probiotics and having their effect, as well as another study looking at long COVID. So one of the studies which came out, again, it was just a pilot study. So for those who don't know much about research, often we do these pilot studies just to, I guess, a proof of concept, but they're quite small. So you have to kind of interpret them with caution. But it looked at, again, a different probiotic with, I think it was a specific type of digestive enzyme, and showed that reduced, symptoms of fatigue in people who reported long COVID. So I think there's going to be a really exciting area of specific probiotics for managing COVID-19 and the symptoms of long COVID. But at the moment, I would say there isn't enough convincing evidence for me to recommend specific probiotics, widespread. And like you said, it's probably going to be coming down to diet, but also we know that sleep, obviously it directly impacts the immune system, but also after just 2 days of sleep deprivation, that also has a negative impact on a gut microbiome. And then there is some other studies highlighting that, disrupted dysbiosis in the gut microbiome space can also have a negative impact on your sleep. So there is that bidirectional relationship there. And then obviously movement. So we know that is another key one. I mean, not to get too much into the dietary space, but there was a nice study which came out recently in I think it was like 1,000 participants, and showed that people who were eating plant-based, so not necessarily plants only, but plant-based, had a much lower risk of becoming unwell with COVID compared to those who are having a low-carb diet or a high-protein diet. Again, just looking at how these kind of restrictive diets actually typically do cut out whole plant food groups, and therefore can really have a negative impact on our gut microbes. Because, something I see often, people on the keto diet, for example, and they say, oh, look, I'm getting loads of fiber. It's coming from my veg. I'm like, yeah, that's great. But actually, we know that the fiber that comes from your whole grains and from your legumes and your fruit are actually very different to the fibers that come from veg, and therefore can act very different towards your gut microbiome. So these restrictive diets do have a negative impact on gut microbial diversity. So you do need to think about, I guess, the long-term kind of consequences of these kind of restrictive diets. And we think maybe that might be why we see a lot of yo-yo dieting effects of these diets, because it's really impacted the gut metabolism axis. And therefore, when people start to include things like carbs in their diet, that can do that damage, and they not only regain that weight, but much more.
Yeah, it's certainly something commonly seen anecdotally as well whenever I speak to patients who have changed their diets, and then they end up going trending upwards as well, and they're constantly changing diet and changing, the restricted set of ingredients that they include. Just going back to the initial, one of the studies that you mentioned about the reduction in severe COVID and those needing respiratory support with the multi-strain probiotic. Do you remember what probiotics they actually gave them, and how they came to those probiotics versus all the other types of probiotics that we use in clinical settings?
Yeah, this is a bit of a frustration, I think, of the probiotic world, is often it's just whatever is available or what company is going to provide them. So right. A lot of the key probiotic formulations do have, the bifidobacteria, the lactobacillus, the different strains within them. But when I read the paper, there didn't, to me, seem like a whole lot of thought had gone into the, specific selection. And, I guess I've had the opportunity to see on the researcher side of things is that it's very hard to get a specific probiotic manufactured according to the strains that you want in that. So you have to kind of use what's nearly available for you. So the probiotic that was used, I don't know the name off the top of my head, but I'll let you know for the show notes. And that is now available commercially. But the study, there was some dodgy points in the study where some of the reviewers were like, I think I want to see this repeated again. Right. And the annoying thing I mentioned about those 12 different studies currently underway, most of them, again, are using different probiotics, which is, this whole world of frustration around probiotics is that each different type, as you've highlighted, does different things. So it kind of clouds the potential benefit of probiotics, because you get a positive one, a negative study, a positive study, negative study, because they're using different strains which have different mechanistic effects. So we need to move to a place of, being able to go, okay, this strain will be ideal for this specific condition, and then kind of building a combination, but that is really difficult from the research world.
And super expensive, I guess, as well. I guess you also need to know like what environment you're introducing those probiotics into as well. So that the state of the microbiota before treatment, during treatment, and after treatment, and how you selected said probiotics. But then getting the enough numbers to make that significant enough is a huge frustration and a hugely expensive.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a really good point around the environment that, you're putting these probiotics to. And this is a reason why actually these commercial microbiome tests, is not something that I currently recommend people do. And yes, we collect stool samples and we do the tests, although much more detailed tests in the research setting, but actually identical bacteria can act very different in two different people's guts. So just seeing the types of bacteria according to these commercial reports that you've got in you doesn't actually provide us with much clinical evidence. Plus, it only gives you a very small snapshot. So there's thousands of bacteria that haven't been sequenced and therefore won't show up on those tests at the moment. Right. So that's a bit of a side point. But again, I would say save your money, spend it on quality food instead. And maybe in 5 or so years, we'll have more valid and robust kind of commercial microbiome tests.
Yeah. Putting the clinical side of these microbiota tests to one side, is there any behavioral change, positive benefit of seeing someone's microbes change from poorly diverse to more diverse on the basis of, let's say, a 2-week change in diet, or a 4-week or an 8-week or whatever? Do you think that holds any value at all, or do you think they're just actually
no. Absolutely. I mean, on a case-by-case basis, I often do these tests with some of my clients who want quantitative assessment of how diet has impacted their health. And I completely get it, particularly for those more analytical minds. They want data, right? So have actually done these sorts of, tests at baseline. We'll get the fecal test done. You follow this diet, i.e. I've done the diversity diet with them for 4 weeks, and then you get it again. And then, we get some really cool data to show that you increase your microbiome alpha diversity by, 25%, and you've increased, the butyrate production, etc. But firstly, they are expensive. So I only deal with clients who obviously have a lot of money. And I tell them at the very start that this is just going to kind of help motivate you versus it going to change my clinical recommendations. Yeah.
I think it's a really good point. I think, whenever people ask me about these tests, I always say, well, don't do it in isolation because A, they're very hard to interpret, and B, you could, go down a rabbit hole of trying to perfectly prescribe a diet to increase certain levels of microbes. And like you've said, you don't know all the microbes that are in there because it's not a full assay. And it can lead to like anxiety behaviors around eating specifically to change the numbers on an investigation. So I think it's a really interesting area, but certainly not one that I recommend is ready for prime time.
Yeah, and Rupi, we touched on our gut microbiome being mostly bacteria, but we also have the viral component that's called the virome, the fungal component called the microbiome, got the parasite component, which actually all of these different types of microorganisms synergistically work together. And although obviously at the moment everyone is so scared whenever you say the word virus, but actually the vast majority living within us are thought to have that synergistic kind of relationship. And some early studies looking at things like inflammatory bowel disease and IBS, it's thought to actually be these people are missing some key protective parasites within their gut. So actually these kind of scary names that we've been taught to be, fearful of actually may have a protective benefit on our body.
Yeah. Are there particular microbe tests that you warm towards, but obviously with the caveat that you should be doing it with a registered dietitian?
So I think there's quite a few on the market, any which looks at the alpha diversity. So I would check that they've got that measure, because some of them will just give you things like how much bifidobacteria do you have, how much lactobacillus, but you want that diversity measure because that's kind of the one that we most associate with overall health. There are some on the market that do sound really impressive in terms of they'll tell you how much, of the acetate and the butyrate and the propionate, those short chain fatty acids that are produced and things like that. But actually what we find is like 95% of these short chain fatty acids are reabsorbed into the body. So the stool samples, again, might not be a great predictor according to your genetic background and all of that sort of stuff. So I wouldn't worry about investing money in these extra kind of facets of your stool. I would just go for alpha diversity is probably the key one.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about weight management actually, because I'm constantly asked about it and I don't talk about weight management as much. I've been chatting a bit about it recently, obviously because it's the time of year, but it was really interesting to hear about the impact of microbes on metabolism and how that might be, well, maybe we can talk a bit about the mechanisms behind that, because you talk quite clearly about the negative points about calorie counting and how calories, I think, especially now the government is trying to plaster it all over our restaurant menus and stuff, it's going to be really anxiety provoking for a lot of people. Why don't we talk a bit about how the microbiota is related to weight management and what the mechanisms behind that are?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great point because, it is really scary how much the calorie point has been pushed. And I know, just as a side point, we know that the calorie information is actually not all that accurate, particularly for whole foods. And certainly what I see in clinic is a lot of people are avoiding whole foods like, nuts and seeds, because like, oh my God, there's so many calories in it. And actually we know things like almonds provide our body with like 30% less calories than what the label says. So the calorie information is not all that accurate to start with. And there is actually really nice research. One paper was undertaken in published in Cell Metabolism, and gave people equivalent calorie controlled diets, but one was full of whole foods and one was ultra processed foods. So identical calories. And of course, as you'd expect, Rupi, those on the ultra processed food put on weight. Those in the whole foods diet actually lost weight, even though they were matched for calories. And, you know, there's many mechanisms, but one is the microbiome. So we know that things like, you know, a Kit Kat and a banana contain, hey, equal calories. So why wouldn't you go the Kit Kat? Little do you know, or if you're not thinking about anything but calories, you appreciate that actually a banana, you know, contains the prebiotics, which feed the gut bacteria. You know, it's got serotonin in it, the happy hormone, all of those sorts of things. But in terms of, I guess, the fiber component, we know that, like we said, that feeds the gut bacteria. They then produce those magical chemicals, those short chain fatty acids. And those short chain fatty acids have been shown to have a really direct impact on things like our body's ability to produce glucose, as well as regulating things like our leptin and hormones, so our appetite hormones. So we know that dietary fiber, as I'm sure a lot of people anecdotally find, if they eat more high fiber foods, actually they feel fuller for longer, and they're less likely to crave other foods. And that's the key mechanisms, those short chain fatty acids that are produced when the bacteria break down that fiber.
Yeah, I love using that study as an example of how like calorie counting is really flawed. And actually, on my app, we do have all the nutritional information in terms of calories as well. And I was loath to add it because we just added it because of popular demand and people utilizing that. You know, each to their own. If some people find calorie counting useful for them and it's been useful for them for many years, then that's fine. But we're actually working on a feature where you can switch off that information because I personally don't find it useful. Whenever I look at some of my recipes, I'm like, how is this over 700 calories? Like, you know, and it's because of, you know, it's got nut butter in, or it's got some peanuts, or it's got, you know, something that pushes the calorie count, but actually is super nutrient dense and something that you want to include in your diet. But even for me, someone who understands the limitations of calories, just seeing that high number is a bit like, oh, how did that happen?
Oh, I'm the same. I love that you're creating that feature, but I appreciate that, you know, having a little bit of understanding of calories can be helpful. So I don't say that completely ditch the whole concept, because, for example, when you're, you know, at the supermarket, if you're comparing like for like foods, you know, having a comparison of the calories, you know, might help you understand actually if that's got extra added sugar in it. Though I'd argue maybe the ingredients list is more important to look at, but it can give you some information. So it's not completely like, you know, dismissing the whole concept, but it's about showing how flawed it is. And, you know, the studies where people have just added more plants into their diet, a nice, you know, systematic review where they pulled together, I think it was 15 individual studies where people just added more plants into their diet, didn't calorie restrict or portion control. Actually, they lost significant amount of weight doing that. So it shows that absolutely you can be really helpful, probably have a much better relationship with food if you just focus on, you know, the whole nature versus calories. You know, you can achieve your weight management goals much easier.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's so much more I want to ask you about. I'm going to finish with a couple of points. You mentioned some of the key complaints or the key sort of obstacles for people, including price. You know, and you sort of break down that myth as well. One of the key issues that I come across is people saying, "Well, I can't eat that because it gives me a lot of bloating." Or, you know, every time I add a little bit of fiber into my diet, or I change to a largely plant-based diet, I blow up like a balloon, and, you know, just doesn't sit well with me. What are some of the simple things that people can think about with regards to bloating if they experience that when transitioning to a more diverse plant-based diet?
Yeah, really important question. I think one element that can help people is understanding of why they're getting those symptoms, because often I see people in clinic where they're experiencing these and they get really fearful. They're like, oh my God, this diet doesn't work for me. It's really bad for me. Look at my body's reaction. So when our bacteria eat the fiber, one of the natural waste products they produce is gas. And if you go from eating a little bit of fiber to a lot of fiber in a short period of time, your bacteria essentially have a foodie frenzy. They binge eat and they produce loads of gas. And again, if your gut lining's not used to that, you know, big burst of gas production, then that can trigger this kind of activation of the gut-brain axis and can be more likely to stimulate things like the bloating in your tummy, as well as tummy pain, etc. But certainly what we see both in the clinical setting and the research setting, that slow introduction of these high fiber foods. So I'm saying instead of, you know, going from 10 grams of fiber to 50 grams of fiber in the space of a month, actually, maybe that might take you 6 months to achieve. So maybe on a day-to-day basis, instead of having an extra half a cup of legumes, you might want to have a quarter of a cup of legumes, or instead of having an extra whole piece of fruit, if you are really sensitive, having half a piece of fruit. What happens is your gut bacteria actually really do learn to more efficiently metabolize those foods, and actually the amount of gas that kind of gets trapped in your tummy is much reduced, because the bacteria can actually break down that gas a little bit more, and also your gut lining can then reabsorb that gas, and actually a lot of it gets breathed out through your breath instead of it being coming out the back end or being trapped in your gut. So slow, steady introduction of these high fiber foods. So think about half a portion compared to what you may think of the standard portion. And actually in the book, I do have a sensitive tummies menu plan for people who experience this. It's kind of that easy way into eating more plants. But the second point I think is a really important one, is that you need to have a relaxed gut to be able to increase the amount of fiber you've got in your diet. And the reason for that is because, like I mentioned, having a very stressed gut means that you can't absorb a lot of that gas the bacteria have produced. So if you've got a stressed gut, it gets trapped in your tummy, and therefore it triggers the bloating. Whereas if you've got a relaxed gut, then actually that gas that's produced can get into your blood system, and then you actually breathe out through your lungs. So how do we get a relaxed gut? Things like, the mindfulness, relaxing that gut brain axis. So what it might be like 5 minutes of meditation, going for a gentle walk, but also actually if you've had a gut infection, for example, you can have a stressed gut that way. So again, if you've just had a gut infection, it might be a case of going even more slowly with your reintroduction of fiber, because your gut is a little bit damaged. And then actually, even if you never really thought meditation was important for you, it is actually, particularly for those people, for the recovery, because we know that even subconscious stress up here really can strangle how the gut lining really regenerates. So it is quite important to do. And Rupi, please tell me your app does kind of support a little bit of mindfulness elements to it as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, we're introducing we're introducing a content section at the moment where we're going to be doing little tutorial videos on mindset, motivation, as well as the foundations of building a nutritional plate and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting. So with a lot of us going back to work, a lot of us eat al desco, and I'm guilty of this as well. Like I often will eat in front of my computer. I know, shock horror, watching like reruns of Saturday Kitchen or something like that, as I always do. But what I've done certainly to improve my bloating after eating, which obviously happens if I'm eating in a rush as well, is to just take 60 seconds and just breathe through my nose and out through my mouth before I start eating. And then also just slow down the whole eating process, because I tend to scoff food, and that's certainly helped me. And I think also the concept of the gases being reabsorbed via the gut lining and then being breathed out is something that I don't think a lot of people understand. And I think I'm really glad you mentioned that, because most people think of, okay, I've got this fiber, it's going to increase the gas and that's going to cause the bloating. It's not going to be able to go out any other way other than out the back or out the front, and that's why I'm burping, that's why I'm blowing up, and so that concept of actually, no, this gas is reabsorbed slower across the gut lining, really important to get that across.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love those tips about the mindful eating aspect, taking that 60 seconds, chewing your food well, because they sound like such simple strategies, but with a lot of my clients, I say, who are really bad in terms of like the bloating side of things, I say, look, do this one strategy for a week. If you don't get any symptom improvement, hey, we'll come back, we'll get something called stronger. But actually, like 30% of people, that is literally it for their really bad bloating. That's all they had to do. So, hey, save yourself the clinical appointment, try that strategy. And yeah, 30% of you will be like, oh my God, it's been a life changer.
Yeah, amazing. Well, there's so many tips, so much more as well in your first book that really takes you through the whole process of essentially coming to see you in clinic, which I absolutely loved as well. We've done a podcast on that before too, so there's so much to get involved in. Plus, all your great stuff on social media, on the newsletter, your inner gut community. Tell me a bit about that. Is that your newsletter community that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, I guess, giving people that extra level of information, people who don't just want, a short caption on Instagram, but actually want to be updated on, new research, new recipes, and I guess embrace the power of the gut to that slightly higher level. So it's completely free to join. But I just, wanted to offer people that extra bit because it is such an exciting and landmark space. And I want people to come to the gut health doctor as their first port of call before they, get taken maybe for a ride and tried all these crazy diets, ruin their relationship with food, harm their gut microbiome, all those sorts of things I often see, in clinics. I want to kind of get to people before other people may,
yeah, no, that's
not so nice.
Yeah, no, totally, yeah, and I totally respect that mission as well. Just before we end, how do you get probiotics in your? I know you get everything else in terms of, but how do you get probiotics in your diet?
Yeah, so I during winter do take the probiotic, which has the Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG and the Bifidobacterium 12. So I do that to reduce my risk of the common cold, because there is a Cochrane review on it. So I'm like, yeah, good evidence. Let's do this.
And your hubby does work in medicine as well, so he's going to be.
Yeah, oh my god, and also having.
And you got a little one now.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I need to defend. In terms of dietary elements. Now, the whole world of fermented foods, we didn't really dive into this. And historically, a lot of it was based on test tube studies showing that actually these fermented foods contain these bioactive components, which could have health benefits, etc. But actually, just a couple of months ago, there was a new paper released showed that people who had a range of different fermented foods in their diet, from things like kefir, live yogurt, kimchi, etc., including them in the diet, significantly in a clinical trial increased their alpha diversity of their gut microbes. So I do personally include a range of different fermented foods in my diet. By me, we've got a live yogurt. Interestingly, with those two bacteria, Lactobacillus rhamnosus and Bifidobacterium B12, for those immune benefits. But those sorts of things. I definitely, do make a conscious effort to include, and I actually love the flavor of them. For those who aren't, that keen, small amounts, your taste buds again will start to crave them over time. There's nothing better than kimchi and poached eggs on sourdough.
I love it. I was converted to this idea of kimchi, scrambled eggs, sourdough. I mean, it's to someone who hasn't tried it or is not used to like that sour bitterness, it sounds terrible. But actually, for me and even Rochelle as well, we love it. We love that combo. It's fantastic.
Definitely. Everyone needs to try it before they knock it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Megan, thank you so much for your time. Honestly, it's been a pleasure to catch up as well. And I can't wait for this to go out. And your book is smashing it. Eat More, Live Well. It's a brilliant book, tons of recipes, and I can't wait to see what you come up with next. I have a few predictions as to what I think we could be seeing as well.
Well, tell me. I mean, I feel like I need you to plant those seeds in my head because.
Well, I definitely think extending the line of probiotic foods, so beyond the yogurts to things like kimchi and sauerkrauts that are made in a particular method that is shown to improve the probiotic density of those. Maybe this is wild card, going into specific probiotic lines as well yourself at some point in the future in terms of supplements, and I see a gut health cafe at some point as well.
I mean, you've heard it here first, Ruthie. We'll have to wait and see. Are you really a fortune teller? In which case,
I know.
You'll be making millions.
I know. I should be. I really should be. I should just be like backing it with investment. Anyway, thanks again. I'll see you in a year for sure. But we'll definitely meet up sooner, so nutmeg and pistachio can actually meet.
It's a must.